The gavel cracked through the courtroom air, and the judge said, "Motion denied." The hall exhaled, while Elena Brooks stood still as frost. Marcus Hale said, "Breathe, Elena," but his voice trembled. Daniel Ward watched from the back row, eyes steady and unreadable. A phone buzzed in Elena's coat, and the screen flashed an unknown number. Ava Quinn said, "Answer it," from the doorway, defiant and scared. Elena answered, and a whisper said, "You missed the only truth that mattered." The line clicked, and the silence felt staged. Vivian Cross met Elena's eyes, calm as glass, and smiled without warmth. The clerk stacked files like tombstones, and the verdict felt nailed shut. Elena said, "If they will not open the door, I will," and walked into the rain. Night gripped the city, while Elena stepped into the rain, as if into a vow. Marcus said, "You do not owe them another fracture," but he fell into step anyway. Ava lingered beneath the awning, and she said, "You are chasing the wrong absence." The unknown caller's whisper tunneled through Elena's thoughts like a fuse. Daniel stood back, counting exits, and he said, "Storms clear evidence and people." Vivian watched the street with a patient smile that promised cost. The clerk turned off lights one by one, until only the portico glowed. A siren wailed far off, cold and nameless. Elena said, "Someone buried the truth in plain sight." The rain answered with relentless applause. They crossed to a narrow diner that kept its lights low, and its secrets lower. Marcus said, "Sit. Heat first," sliding coffee that steamed like a truce. Elena did not drink, and the cup cooled into a small moon. Ava slipped into the booth and said, "You missed a file that was never logged." The neon flickered, sketching bars across their faces. Elena said, "Tell me where," and her voice made the window stop rattling. Marcus said, "We vet the source before we move." Ava drew a symbol, and she said, "Ask Daniel why he knows that room key code." Outside, rain stitched the street into one dark seam. A clock ticked like a metronome for a verdict they did not trust. Daniel arrived with his collar damp and his calm intact. He said, "You two should not be here," but he sat anyway. Ava said, "You know the records room like a hymn," and the booth tightened. Marcus said, "If you can help, help now," and his jaw clicked. Elena watched the door, and her silence gathered weight. Daniel said, "Boxes go missing when they never officially existed." The neon buzzed like a trapped insect. Elena said, "Then we find what does not admit to being real." Outside, a black sedan paused, and the rain softened as if listening. Somewhere, a tire hissed like a secret escaping. Vivian entered with rain beating on an immaculate umbrella, and the room recalibrated. She said, "Justice is a ledger, and yours is overdrawn." Marcus stood but did not speak. Ava said, "Tell them about the sealed letter," and Elena's pulse stuttered. Vivian smiled, and the clock forgot a beat. Daniel said, "We keep this off the grid," but he avoided Elena's eyes. Elena said, "The letter stays sealed until truth earns it." The waiter pretended to refill water to hear more. Vivian said, "Then you will never read it," and turned toward the door. The bell chimed, and all their shadows stretched long. Dawn broke in ash colors, as Elena stood at the river overlook where the city keeps its ghosts. Marcus said, "You come here when the verdicts lie," and he kept a respectful step behind. She held the sealed letter like a match she refused to strike. Ava hovered near the railing and said, "You think answers live where people disappear." The wind lifted old police tape from a thorn bush like a tired flag. Elena said, "I walked away when others could not," and the sentence shivered in the air. Marcus said, "Guilt is not evidence," yet his eyes asked her to rest. A barge horn rolled across the water like a slow summons. Elena traced a name carved into metal and said, "My Elaine never got to testify." Ava said, "Maya never got to be heard." The letter bent in her grip until the paper sighed. Elena said, "We anchor here, then we move." Elena's apartment was arranged like a diagram of exits and second chances. Marcus set a pan on the stove and said, "Eat before you break the next wall." She lined a letter beside a map of the courthouse like a dare. Ava wandered the shelves and said, "No photos of you, but plenty of doors." The kettle clicked, and the quiet returned to its watch. Elena said, "I was meant to catalog facts, then truth slipped the shelf." Marcus said, "Truth is not fragile," and slid a plate toward her. A message popped on her phone and dissolved before it could be read. Ava said, "Someone wants you hungry for crumbs." Elena said, "Let them feed me a trail." Marcus said, "I pay the check if the bill turns ugly." The city sirens braided with distant rain, and the room steadied. They sat across from Diane Lane in a community hall that smelled of floor, wax, and hope. Diane said, "My girl was bright as a struck match, and the chairs creaked in sympathy." Elena listened with her hands still, as if receiving a fragile instrument. Marcus said, "We will not drag you through another theater." Diane said, "I want the truth, even if it is mean." Ava placed a drawing on the table and said, "Maya kept this symbol in her notebooks." Elena said, "The symbol marks records that never entered the system." Diane breathed like someone adjusting to a colder season. A clock counted loud enough to shame their delay. Elena said, "We will give her a voice that does not expire." Diane nodded, and grief steadied into a kind of armor. In the courthouse basement, the air tasted like cardboard and secrets. Daniel arrived with a keycard and said, "You do not have clearance, but I have a favor." Marcus said, "Favors keep receipts," and his jaw worked. Elena watched the red light flicker to green like a grudging oath. Ava said, "If a box exists, it exists under the wrong name." Daniel said, "Look for the gaps the inventory refuses to count." The shelves hummed with the building's breath. Elena said, "We will stitch the missing threads." Marcus angled his body between them and the corridor. Ava traced the symbol on a clipboard and said, "Same hand as the sketch." Daniel said, 5 minutes, then alarms. Elena smiled like a blade and said, 4 is enough." They regrouped in a parking garage where echoes carry names to the wrong ears. Marcus said, "You do not have to be the one who takes the hit." Elena said, "I already took it, and I am still here." Ava paced a line of oil stains and said, "The symbol points to a storage annex no one admits exists." Daniel checked his phone and said, "I can get you 10 minutes inside." A shadow moved on the upper level and kept moving. Elena said, "When we open that door, the letter opens with it." Marcus said, "Then we open both and keep breathing." Ava said, "Maya will not be a rumor." The air tightened as if a storm had found them underground. Elena said, "We anchor to truth and cut every rope that lies." The echo came back like a vow returned. Night folded around the municipal annex like a locked jaw, and Elena pressed Daniel's borrowed keycard to a blank door. Marcus said, "We move if it fails," while his eyes traced the cameras. The light flicked green with the reluctance of a confession. Ava said, "Left aisle, 4th bay. Look for the false label." The corridor breathed recycled chill that smelled of wet paper. Daniel said, "You have 7 minutes," and his voice stayed level. Elena found a box stamped with an alias that pretended to be routine. Marcus said, "Gloves," and snapped a pair into her palm. The lid side open onto a ledger, a tape, and a photo of Maya. Ava said, "This symbol repeats like a scar." Elena said, "We catalog, copy, and vanish." Somewhere metal thumped, and Daniel said, "We are not alone." Elena photographed each page while the clock inside her ribs hammered. Marcus said, "Ledger shows payouts routed through a church fund." Ava said, "The tape label matches Diana's timeline." Daniel stood guard at the corridor bend and said, "Footsteps are doubling back." The photo of Maya stared up like a witness who refused to blink. Elena said, "We duplicate and leave decoys." The hum of the lights faltered, as if the room considered them trespass. Marcus said, "If we move now, we keep the chain clean." Ava slipped the copied ledger into a sleeve and said, "No fingerprints, no delays." The door latch clicked from the far end, soft as a warning. Daniel said, 3 minutes, and his hand tightened on the handle. Elena shut the box and breathed the room back into stillness. They spilled into the stairwell as the elevator chimed like a smile with teeth. Marcus said, "South exit," and pushed the crash bar with his shoulder. A security guard looked up from a phone and measured them in silence. Daniel said, "Maintenance check," and flashed a badge that was not his. Ava folded into shadow and said, "Camera blind spot in 3 steps." Elena kept the ledger tight against her ribs, as if it could warm. The guard said, "You do not belong here at this hour." Marcus said, "We will be out before the coffee cools." The man hesitated, then reached for a radio that spoke in static. Elena said, "We can answer now or be chased later," and chose now. The door gulped them into an alley that smelled like rain and old oil. At the diner, steam curled from mugs like spent prayers, while the ledger lay between napkin holders. Diane arrived with eyes that had learned to hold weight, and she said, "Tell me what my daughter paid for." Elena said, "Funds laundered through a trust with court ties." Ava said, "The symbol tags files that were ghosted." Marcus said, "We need a judge outside this circle," and his fingers tapped. Diane touched Maya's photo and said, "She drew that symbol on grocery lists." The bell rang again, and Vivian entered with an umbrella that did not drip. She said, "You are trespassing in history." Daniel watched the door and did not blink. Elena said, "History can testify." Vivian smiled like a promise with a cost. Vivian said, "Evidence misplaced is evidence that never was," and the neon hummed approval. Elena said, "We have copies that breathe." Marcus said, "We will deliver to a federal clerk by sunrise." Ava said, "If we are not followed by ghosts with keys." Daniel's phone lit with a message that refused to show its sender. Diane said, "I can name the pastor behind the fund," and her voice steadied. Vivian said, "Careful which doors you open. They close on hands." The room paused as if the walls were taking notes. Elena said, "We opened them anyway," and slid the ledger into a bag. Rain began again, soft and deliberate, like someone practicing an alibi. The bell chimed, and Vivian did not move aside. The ledger spread across Elena's table under the weight of dawn shadows. Marcus said, "These transfers connect to judges' campaigns." Ava traced a symbol and said, "This was on Maya's sketchbook too." Daniel leaned against the wall and said, "We cannot submit this through normal channels." Elena's hands trembled, but her voice was steady when she said, "Then we use channels that burn back." Vivian's name appeared on one line like a spine through every secret. Marcus said, "She was in this from the start," and the silence swelled. Ava said, "She is not just watching, she is steering." The phone buzzed again, flashing unknown. Elena said, "Answers come with teeth," and pressed decline. They met Diane in the church basement where folding chairs and hymnals carried dust. Diane said, "That pastor shook hands with Vivian more than with God." Marcus said, "We can cross-check donations." Ava tugged at her hoodie string and said, "The receipts carry the same symbol." Elena said, "Maya marked what no one wanted seen." Daniel scanned the ceiling vents, unease growing. Diane set a folder on the table and said, "These are letters she hid in choir books." Elena opened one, and the ink seemed too fresh for memory. Marcus said, "Vivian kept this circle closed tight." Elena said, "Then we break it open, even if it cuts." The tape played in Marcus' car, voices grainy but sharp enough to wound. A man said, "The girl is handled." Silence stretched like a verdict. Elena clenched the dash and said, "That is Maya's last night." Ava covered her ears, whispering, "She was not supposed to vanish." Daniel said, "This tape alone could fracture the case." Marcus said, "It also paints a target." The rain outside blurred streetlights into broken halos. Elena said, "They silenced her, but not her echo." Ava said, "We will not let her echo fade." Marcus's knuckles whitened on the wheel, and the car idled like a trapped breath. They confronted Vivian in her office, high above the city, where silence ruled. Vivian said, I built stability from chaos, and you want to wreck it. Elena said, you built it from bones you buried. Marcus said, we have the ledger, the tape, the trail. Vivian smiled faintly and said, truth bends to influence. Ava slammed her sketchbook down and said, not this truth. Daniel's eyes flickered, caught between allegiance and betrayal. Vivian rose, flawless and cold, and said, you are trespassing in a house that never falls. Elena said, houses fall when foundations crack. The city lights outside pulsed like a warning. The group spilled into the rooftop parking as alarms began to echo. Marcus said, she will erase everything by morning. Elena said, then we strike tonight. Ava held the tape close like a relic. Daniel said, if we take this federal, she burns the witnesses first. Elena said, we cannot wait for clean hands. Marcus's phone lit with threats sent from an unmarked number. Vivian's voice carried through the garage intercom saying, you are playing a game that ends with ruin. Elena said, then let it end with ruin, but not silence. The night deepened as if siding with her. The courthouse reopened under storm clouds that pressed down like a verdict of their own. Elena carried the bag with the ledger and tape, as if it were an oath. Marcus said, we hand this to the federal clerk, and do not blink. Ava said, Vivian will already have ears inside. Daniel walked a step behind, his silence a blade neither drawn nor sheathed. Elena pushed through the metal detector, alarms screaming from her heart more than the machine. A bailiff eyed them with suspicion and said, business this early. Elena said, justice does not keep business hours. The clerk's office door loomed, but the handle felt like a trigger. Inside the clerk's office, papers towered like monuments of neglect. Elena said, file these under sealed record priority. The clerk adjusted his glasses and said, that category requires judicial clearance. Marcus leaned in and said, lives depend on this staying intact. Ava tapped the tape on the counter and said, this is a voice silenced by your system. The clerk hesitated, pen hovering like a reluctant sword. Daniel said, stamp it, or it vanishes in the gap. Elena's voice cut low. History will not forgive delay. The stamp came down, heavy and final, like a drumbeat calling war. The courtroom filled again, a stage rebuilt for a play the city wished to forget. Vivian sat poised at the front row, her black coat immaculate, eyes fixed like iron. Elena said, we bring the truth into light. Marcus whispered, be ready, she will twist it. Ava clutched her sketchbook, the symbol circled like a wound that never closed. Daniel stood behind, hands locked, face unreadable. The judge entered, robes brushing the air into silence. Vivian rose slightly and said, Your Honor, I request dismissal on grounds of fabrication. Elena stood and said, The evidence speaks without fear. The gallery leaned forward, breath held as if chained. The tape played for the room, and Maya's ghost filled the silence. A male voice said, The girl is handled, then static gnawed at the air. Diane's sob echoed from the gallery, sharp as a fracture. Vivian said, Audio can be forged. Elena said, But grief cannot. Marcus rose and said, Ledger, entries, taped voices, matching symbols. This is no fiction. Ava whispered, She is here with us, and her hand shook but held steady. Daniel closed his eyes, and for a moment his mask cracked. The judge's gavel struck once, not to silence but to steady. The chamber quivered under truth. Vivian rose, voice like velvet, slicing steel. She said, You believe paper and echoes outweigh power? Elena said, We believe in voices you buried. Marcus said, Your ledger marks every life you traded. Ava said, Maya's silence ends here. Daniel stepped forward, his choice sharpening, and said, I logged those files. I was ordered to vanish them. Gasps tore through the gallery like breaking glass. Vivian's eyes narrowed, yet her poise held. Elena said, Truth does not vanish, it waits. The gavel struck again, and the judge's words carried final weight. This court will not dismiss. Vivian's smile thinned into a crack. The ruling held for now, and the courthouse exhaled a tired breath as rain eased into mist. Elena said, "We are not finished," and she gripped the bag as if it were Pulson-proof. Marcus said, "We moved the ledger to a safer lane," and he scanned the exits like a map of nerves. Ava said, "Diane should hear before the city edits the truth again," and her hoodie shed beads of water. Daniel said, "Vivian will not appeal in daylight, she hunts at dusk," and his voice carried a careful dread. Diane met them near the steps and said, "My girl's echo reached the bench." Elena said, "The echo is becoming testimony." Marcus said, "We expect a counterstrike couched in procedure." Vivian watched from a black sedan and said, "You mistake momentum for victory." Ava said, "We mistake nothing," and she held the tape like a lit fuse. Daniel's phone shook with a message that read, "Mind your loyalties." Elena said, "We mind only the record," and the mist felt colder than rain. They chose the community hall, where floors remembered grief and folding chairs knew names. Diane said, "You gave Maya back a voice," and her hands trembled until they steadied on the table. Elena said, "We will place copies with a federal custodian tonight." Marcus said, "I booked a secure locker with a warrant shadow," and his tones sounded like steel wrapped in cloth. Ava said, "The symbol appears on a pastor's grant list," and she slid a printout marked with careful circles. Daniel said 2 entries linked to Vivian's nonprofit arm, and the words landed like iron. A window clicked in the frame as wind shifted. Diane said, "When morning comes, the city will test you." Elena said, "We will test it back." Marcus said, "We divide routes and rendezvous at the depot." Ava said, "I will run the copies you cannot risk." Daniel said, "I can ghost the cameras for 15 minutes. Elena said, "We move now," and the hall gave a quiet nod. The depot crouched under an overpass where engines muttered and secrets idled. Elena said, "Route A, North Lockers," and her steps counted seconds. Marcus said, "Route B, Clerk Window," and he melted into the line with casual calm. Ava said, "Route C, Copy Room," and she vanished behind humming machines. Daniel said, "Cameras drift now," and the screens obeyed in a soft flicker. A courier approached Elena and said, "You have something that belongs to the city." She said, "It belongs to its dead." And her eyes did not move. Vivian's voice arrived through a passerby's phone on speaker, saying, "Return the artifacts and go home." Marcus said, "Artifacts do not bleed. Ledgers do," and he sealed a box. Ava said, "Duplicates complete," and she smiled without warmth. Daniel said, 5 minutes left, and the underpass wind smelled like diesel and rain. Elena said, "Then we finish in 4. Sirens braided with traffic as they reached the church steps, where the fund once laundered mercy into silence. Diane said, "He is inside, and he will try to bless this away," and her voice carried no tremor. Elena said, "Confession belongs to the record," and she set the tape on the rail like a metronome. Marcus said, "We ask for the ledger names from the pulpit ledger," and his jaw was a locked hinge. Ava said, "The symbol is carved beneath the hymn rack," and she lifted it with 2 careful fingers. Daniel said, "Phones are jamming," and his screen froze on a mosaic of static. Vivian stepped from the shadows and said, "Truth without power is a sermon no one attends." Elena said, "Then we make it a summons." Marcus said, "Pastor first," and he pushed the door that resisted like a lie. The nave took their echo and held it. Inside, the pastor said, "You mistake stewardship for sin," and he clutched a ledger bound in piety. Elena said, "We mistake nothing, we count," and her hand hovered above the tape recorder. Marcus said, "These transfers bought silence from benches and pews," and his voice did not seek permission. Ava said, "Maya marked your margins," and she set the symbol plate on the altar. Daniel said, "Police are inbound," but the call came from a private line, and his eyes flicked to Vivian. Vivian said, "If you win tonight, you inherit the ashes," and the nave lights throbbed once. Diane stepped forward and said, "Say my daughter's name," and the pastor froze. Elena said, "Say it now," and the room pulled tight as wire. The pastor whispered, "Maya," and the ledger shook. Elena said, "Justice is not clean, but it is awake," and the night seemed to open a door. Morning leaked through a sky of gray iron as Elena stood on the courthouse steps, the tape and ledger sealed in federal custody. Marcus said, "We survived the strike, but the board is not cleared." Ava said, "Maya's name is louder than their silence now," and she lifted her sketchbook like proof. Daniel kept to the side, his eyes red, his loyalty cracked, but still tethered. Vivian stepped from a car and said, "Trials end, but control never does." Elena said, "Control erodes when truth breathes." Diane said, her voice is written into the record, and her shoulders carried lighter grief. The press snapped photos like hungry vultures. Marcus said, "They will try to drown us in noise." Elena said, "Noise cannot erase a name carved in echo," and she walked into the gray light. That night, the safe house hummed with silence, broken only by distant sirens. Marcus said, "We will not sleep easy until indictments follow." Elena unwrapped the sealed letter she had carried for years, her hands steady now. Eva said, "You kept it like a wound," and leaned forward. Elena read aloud, "If I do not return, tell them Maya mattered." Diane's tears fell without sound, as though the words themselves absorbed them. Daniel sat in shadow, whispering, "I carried her file the night it vanished." Elena said, "She is no longer vanished." Marcus said, "The fight is not done," but hope bent into his tone. The letter folded back into Elena's coat, lighter at last. The city moved on, but the scars lingered like graffiti beneath new paint. Elena walked through the river overlook where Maya's name was carved in steel. She said, "We did not erase her, and we will not." Marcus said, "You carried her further than the court ever could." Ava said, "Names are more than verdicts," and she sketched the carving into her book. Daniel stood apart, whispering a name only the wind heard. Diane touched the steel letters and said, "She is finally seen." Vivian's absence was louder than her presence, a shadow waiting in another corner of the city. Elena said, "We stand until standing is enough," and the river carried her words like a vow. News anchors argued on glowing screens, some praising courage, others dismissing chaos. Elena turned away from the noise and said, "We did not chase applause, we chased truth." Marcus said, "History will bend, but it cannot break her name now." Ava said, "They can smear us, but Maya is etched beyond their edits." Daniel whispered, "Vivian will rebuild her circle elsewhere," and his shoulders sagged. Diane said, "Circles break when people refuse to kneel." Elena stared at the skyline, lit by 1,000 lies and truths fighting for space. She said, "We fought one crime no one wanted to solve." Marcus said, "And made it unforgettable." Silence followed, heavy but alive. Elena returned alone to the courthouse steps at midnight, the mist curling like memory. She said softly, "My Elaine, you are not forgotten," and the words lifted into the dark. The sealed letter rested now in archives, its weight replaced by resolve. Marcus's voice echoed in her mind, "We kept breathing when they wanted silence." Ava's defiant laughter flickered like a ghost of flame. Daniel's fractured loyalty lingered as an unanswered prayer. Vivian's shadow stretched across the city, but it no longer swallowed her. Elena stood still, the rain touching her face like absolution. She said, "Justice is not perfect, but it is awake." The courthouse clock struck, and its toll hung like a final chord that would not fade.